The courtroom doesn't open with shock or noise. It opens with a truth that feels almost unreal. A married woman was lured to her death not by a stranger, not by an enemy in the dark, but by the woman who called herself her mother-in-law. A woman who smiled, reassured, and promised safety. A woman who said, "Come home with me." And somewhere between that promise and the return ticket that was never used, Surjit Kaur Athwal disappeared. The prosecutors don't start with how she died. They start with why she wanted to live. A young wife who no longer fits inside the boundaries of the marriage chosen for her. An arranged union built on obedience, control, and silence. Surjit didn't want to burn the house down. She wanted out. She wanted a divorce. She wanted her children. She wanted to breathe without permission. And for that, she became a problem. Her desire for independence wasn't loud or reckless. It was gradual. A job that paid her own money, clothes that reflected who she was becoming, friends who reminded her that life could be wider than the walls she lived inside. But to her husband's family, especially his mother, independence didn't look like growth. It looked like rebellion, like shame, like something that needed to be corrected. Behind closed doors, the marriage turned into a battlefield. On one side, Surjit asks for separation, for safety, for a future she could choose. On the other, a family determined to stop her at any cost. Divorce wasn't just a legal threat, it was a public humiliation. It meant questions, it meant whispers, it meant honor slipping through their fingers. And in that household, honor mattered more than Surjit's life. So when she was invited to travel to India with her mother-in-law, it didn't look like danger. It looked like a negotiation. Weddings to attend, elders to consult. Promises that once they returned, the divorce would be handled properly. It looked like the end of the fight, but it wasn't the end. It was a trap. As the courtroom listens, one question presses against the silence. The kind of question everyone is already asking in their own mind. If Surjit knew she was being controlled, if she feared her husband's family, why did she go? Why would a woman walk willingly into the hands of the people she was trying to escape? To understand that answer, the story can't stay here. It has to go back. Back to who Surjit was before marriage, before fear, before she learned that wanting freedom could cost her everything. It's before Surjit Kaur Athwal was a wife fighting for her freedom. She was a little girl growing up in Coventry, caught between two worlds that never quite agreed with each other. Outside her front door was Britain in the 1970s and 80s. School corridors buzzing with noise, teachers encouraging questions, classmates dreaming out loud about who they wanted to become. Inside her home was something very different. Quiet rules, expectations spoken without being explained. A belief system where girls were taught early that their future was not something they chose, but something they accepted. Surjit was known as bright from a young age, the kind of child who finished her homework early and asked what came next. Teachers noticed her curiosity, the way she listened closely and absorbed everything. At home, that same curiosity was gently and then firmly redirected. Good girls didn't question. Good girls didn't argue. Good girls learned how to compromise their wants before they ever learned how to name them. Love, she was told, came from obedience. Safety came from silence. As she grew older, the pressure became more defined. Conversations about education slowly shifted into conversations about suitability, about reputation, about marriage. Surjit watched cousins and older girls disappear into engagements and weddings, their lives rearranged overnight. She learned what was expected long before anyone formally said it out loud. And like many girls raised this way, she learned how to survive by being agreeable, by nodding even when her chest felt tight. By her mid-teens, the path ahead of her had already been discussed in rooms she wasn't invited into. At 16, while most girls her age were worrying about exams and friendships, Surjit was told she would be married. The decision was framed as destiny, as tradition, as something done out of love. She met the man she was supposed to spend her life with once. One meeting, one conversation, and then it was settled. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She did what she had been trained to do her entire life. She complied, not because she wanted to, but because she had been taught that wanting was dangerous, that resistance only brought trouble, that if something felt wrong, you endured it quietly and trusted that things would somehow make sense later. But that quiet endurance came with a cost, because as Surjit stepped into adulthood, she carried with her an unspoken conflict between the woman she was expected to be and the person she was slowly becoming. And that conflict would only grow sharper once marriage stopped being an idea and became her daily reality. Because the moment Surjit crossed the threshold into married life, she didn't just leave her childhood behind. She walked straight into a house where control had rules and obedience had consequences. Surjit's marriage to Sukhdev Singh Athwal did not begin with love or familiarity. It began with obligation. He was around 10 years older than her, already settled into the expectations of manhood as defined by his family. She was 16, still figuring out who she was allowed to be. Their single meeting before the wedding was brief and formal, filled with polite questions and rehearsed smiles. And there was no space for honesty, no chance to say no. By the time the ceremony took place, the decision had already been made for her. Almost immediately, Surjit understood that this marriage was not a partnership. It was a hierarchy. After the wedding, she moved into her husband's family home, leaving behind what little independence she had. The walls of that house closed in quickly. Every routine, every habit, every choice was now subject to approval. Sukhdev was not openly violent in the beginning, but his control was constant. He expected obedience without explanation, compliance without discussion. When Surjit questioned anything, even gently, it was treated as disrespect. There were moments early on when Surjit tried to convince herself that things would improve, that this was simply an adjustment period. Oh, she told herself that if she learned faster, spoke less, complied more, she would eventually feel safe. But safety never arrived. Instead, the rules multiplied. What she wore, when she spoke, where she went, who she saw. Slowly, her life shrank to the size of the household. Sukhdev did not stand alone in enforcing this control. His loyalty was firmly rooted in his mother, Bachan Kaur Athwal. When disagreements arose, he did not mediate. He reported. When Surjit expressed discomfort or fear, he dismissed it. And when she spoke of wanting something different, something more, he saw it not as unhappiness, but as defiance. Behind closed doors, Surjit began to feel less like a wife and more like a possession being monitored for flaws. Any sign of independence was interpreted as rebellion. Any request for space was seen as disobedience. Love, if it ever existed, was conditional and fragile, and the message was always the same: endure or suffer the consequences. As the months passed, Surjit realized that marriage had not given her stability. It had stripped her of her voice, and the longer she stayed silent, the more dangerous it became to speak at all. Because inside that house, there was one person whose authority outweighed everyone else's, and whose idea of honor would soon determine Surjit's fate. Bachan Kaur Athwal ruled the household without ever needing to raise her voice. She was the kind of woman whose presence alone set the tone of a room, whose silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. As Sukhdev's mother, her word was final, unquestioned, and enforced without hesitation. Tradition in her eyes was not a guideline. It was law. And Surjit, from the moment she entered that home, was measured against it every single day. Nothing Surjit did went unnoticed. Bachan watched how she dressed, how she cooked, how she spoke, how she carried herself. A sleeve rolled too high, a laugh held too long, a question asked when none was expected. Corrections came disguised as advice, criticism wrapped in concern. This is not how a good wife behaves. People will talk. You are bringing shame into this house. Over time, those words settled into Surjit's mind like permanent fixtures. The house itself became a place of constant surveillance. Doors were never fully closed. Conversations were overheard. Phone calls were monitored. Surjit learned to lower her voice, to keep her thoughts private, to exist without drawing attention to herself. Even her movements were scrutinized. When she left, how long she stayed out, what excuse she used to justify it. Privacy was a privilege she was not granted. Bachan framed her control as protection. She spoke often about family honor, about reputation in the community, about how one woman's behavior could stain generations. To her, Surjit was not an individual with desires or fears. She was a reflection of the family's respectability, and reflections, if flawed, had to be corrected. Sukhdev never challenged his mother's authority. In moments when Surjit looked to him for support, he offered none. His silence reinforced Bashan's power, making it clear that Surjit stood alone. The message was unspoken but constant. Resistance would not be tolerated, and independence would be punished. Yet despite the pressure, something inside Surjit refused to disappear. Each criticism, each restriction, and each quiet humiliation chipped away at her patience. And slowly, quietly, she began to imagine a life beyond those walls. Because the more Bachan tried to control her, the more Surjit understood that survival might depend on finding a way out. Surjit's first real taste of freedom didn't come from rebellion. It came from work. When she secured a position with HM Customs and Excise at Heathrow Airport, it changed more than her daily routine. It gave her a reason to leave the house, a paycheck in her own name, and a world that existed beyond the constant gaze of her in-laws. For the first time since her marriage, she stepped into a space where she wasn't being measured as a wife or a daughter-in-law, but simply as herself. The airport was loud, fast, and diverse, everything her home life was not. Colleagues spoke openly, laughed freely, and treated her like an equal. Surjit learned procedures, wore her uniform with pride, and discovered a confidence she hadn't known she was allowed to have. Each shift reminded her that she was capable, respected, and valuable. And with every paycheck, she felt a small but growing sense of control over her own life. At home, the tension sharpened. Bachan did not like the influence work had on Surjit. Independence, even in small doses, was seen as dangerous. Comments about her hours turned into accusations. Questions about her colleagues carried suspicion. The more Surjit grew outside the house, the more confined she felt inside it. Motherhood complicated everything. Surjit had two children, one old enough to understand tension, the other still an infant. She loved them fiercely, and they became both her anchor and her fear. She wanted a better life for them, one not shaped by silence and obedience. But she also knew that leaving would mean risk. The thought of losing her children haunted her, just as much as the thought of staying. Still, the woman Surjit was becoming could not be undone. She began dressing differently, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. She spoke more openly at work. She allowed herself moments of happiness that had nothing to do with her marriage. And in doing so, she crossed an invisible line inside the Athwal household. Because to Bachan and Sukhdev, Surjit's independence wasn't just disobedience. It was a warning sign, a signal that she might one day walk away. And once that possibility became real, the house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a countdown. The cracks in Surjit's marriage were no longer something she could hide behind polite smiles. What had once been tension became open hostility. Arguments that used to happen behind closed doors spilled into everyday life. Sharp comments delivered in front of the children, disapproval hanging thick in the air. Sukhdev grew colder, more dismissive, treating Surjit less like a partner and more like a liability he no longer wanted to manage. It was during this time that Surjit began to reach outward for emotional safety. At work, she found herself talking more, confiding in colleagues who listened without judgment. One connection in particular gave her something she had been missing for years: kindness without conditions. The relationship that followed was not reckless or boastful. It was quiet, careful, and rooted in the simple feeling of being seen. For Surjit, it wasn't about betrayal, it was about survival. But in the Athwal household, perception mattered more than truth. Word spread quickly: a change in clothing, a shift in confidence, time spent away from home. To Bachan, these were not signs of growth. They were proof. Proof that Surjit had stepped outside her role and brought shame with her. And shame in that family was unforgivable. Surjit began to feel watched more closely than ever. Questions turned into interrogations. Her movements were tracked, her phone calls questioned. The atmosphere inside the house grew heavy with unspoken threats. It was then that Surjit started telling people she was afraid. Not dramatically, not hysterically, just quietly in moments of honesty. She told colleagues she didn't feel safe. She told friends she feared her in-laws wanted her gone. Some listened. Others assumed she was exaggerating. No one imagined how literal her fear was. Desperate, Surjit took the step that would ultimately seal her fate. She told her husband she wanted a divorce. She wanted out. She wanted to leave with her children and start over. To her, it was a declaration of self-preservation. To Sukhdev and his family, it was an act of war. Divorce wasn't just a personal decision. It was a public stain. It meant exposure. It meant gossip. It meant losing control. And in Bachan's eyes, it meant that Surjit had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Because once Surjit said the word divorce, the question inside that house was no longer how to control her. It was how to stop her. The family meeting did not include Surjit. It never would have. One, decisions of that magnitude, decisions about honor and reputation, were not made in the presence of the person being discussed. They were made behind closed doors, in lowered voices, where agreement mattered more than conscience. Bachan Kaur Athwal sat at the center of it, calm and deliberate, speaking not with anger, but with certainty. Surjit, she said, had gone too far. A wife asking for divorce, a mother dressing like she didn't belong to the house she lived in, a woman who no longer listened. To Bachan, this wasn't a phase or a misunderstanding. It was contamination. If Surjit left, she wouldn't just leave the marriage, she would talk. She would explain why. She would expose what happened behind those walls. And once that happened, the family's name would never be clean again. Sukhdev listened. He didn't interrupt. And he didn't object. In that silence was his choice. Protecting his wife would have meant standing against his mother, against tradition, against everything he had been raised to honor. Instead, he aligned himself where loyalty had always been demanded. Surjit's fear, her pleas, her desire for independence, none of it mattered more than obedience. Bachan spoke of solutions the way others speak of chores, calmly, practically. This problem, she said, could be handled. Surjit needed to be removed from the situation before she caused more damage. Not publicly, quietly, cleanly, no scenes, no confrontation, no trace. Honor restored without explanation. And then she offered the plan: a trip to India, weddings in Punjab, elders who could talk sense into Surjit, time away to cool tempers, a promise that once they returned, the divorce could be discussed properly. It sounded reasonable, familiar, safe, especially coming from a mother-in-law who had spent years framing control as care. Sukhdev agreed, not with words but with compliance. He would stay behind, keep things normal, handle paperwork, let his mother do what needed to be done. From that moment on, Surjit's fate was no longer uncertain, it was scheduled. All that remained was convincing Surjit that this was an olive branch, not a noose. And soon Bachan would make the offer herself, smiling as she asked Surjit to come home with her. When Bachan Kaur Athwal approached Surjit about the trip, her tone was softer than it had been in years. There were weddings in the family, she said, relatives asking after her, elders who could help calm things down. And most importantly, any time away might help resolve the tension between Surjit and Sukhdev. She spoke of reconciliation, of dignity, of doing things the right way. Divorce, Bachan implied, could be discussed properly once they returned. Not rushed, not embarrassing, respectable. Surjit wanted to believe her. She needed to. By this point, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. The fighting, the fear, the constant pressure, it had all worn her down. A part of her hoped the distance might bring clarity, that elders might support her desire to leave safely with her children. Another part of her simply wanted peace, even if it was temporary. And when the offer came wrapped in tradition and family obligation, refusing it felt dangerous in its own way. On the 4th of December 1998, Surjit left the UK with Bachan, boarding a flight to Delhi. At the airport, she carried herself calmly. There was no scene, no visible distress. To anyone watching, it looked like a routine family trip. But beneath that calm was a quiet unease she couldn't shake. She kissed her children goodbye, telling herself it wouldn't be for long, that she would come back with answers, with a way out. What Surjit did not know was that the trip had already been marked by paperwork and intention. On the very day she boarded that plane, Sukhdev took out a life insurance policy in her name, a silent transaction. No witnesses, no explanation offered. Just a signature and a future already accounted for. It was a detail that would later speak louder than any confession ever could. Once in India, the tone shifted. The warmth Bachchan had shown in England cooled. Plans changed without explanation. Travel became disjointed. Our conversations ended abruptly. Surjit was moved from place to place, increasingly isolated, surrounded by people she barely knew. Her phone calls became fewer. Her voice, when she spoke to anyone back home, sounded distant, strained. And then she stopped calling altogether. Somewhere in Punjab, Surjit Athwal was last seen alive. After that, there were no messages, no sightings, no return flight, just absence. And when the date of her scheduled return to the UK came and went, the silence spoke louder than words ever could. Back in England, questions began to surface, and the people who had sent her away were already preparing their answers. What happened to Surjit in India was never witnessed by the people who loved her. There were no photographs, no recordings, no final phone call explaining where she was going or why. What exists instead is a reconstruction, pieced together years later from testimony, travel records, and the quiet admissions of someone who knew too much for too long. It is a story told in fragments, because that is all that was left. After arriving in Punjab, Surjit was taken away from familiar roots and family gatherings. The weddings she had been promised either never existed or were never meant for her to attend. Each change in plan was explained away casually. Just one more stop. Just one more visit. Trust me. Bachchan stayed close, guiding her, watching her, making sure Surjit remained dependent and compliant. In a country she hadn't lived in for years, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, Surjit had nowhere to run. According to evidence later presented in court, Surjit was taken to a remote location, far from the eyes of neighbors or extended family. There, the last of the deception fell away. She was drugged, her body weakened before she fully understood what was happening. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument loud enough for anyone to overhear. The killing was quiet, strangulation, efficient, deliberate. The kind of act carried out by people who had already decided that the person in front of them no longer mattered. Her body was never meant to be found. It was taken to the Ravi River and disposed of, carried away by water that would erase evidence and deny closure. No grave, no marker, no place for her children to visit. Just a disappearance designed to look like choice or chance rather than violence. From that moment on, Surjit Athwal existed only as a memory, a missing wife, a missing mother, a woman who, and on paper, had simply failed to come home. And that absence was not accidental. It was the final step in a plan built to leave nothing behind. Because once Surjit was gone, the story of what happened to her would belong entirely to the people who wanted her erased. And back in England, they were already deciding which version of that story the world would hear. When Surjit didn't return to the UK on her scheduled flight, concern didn't come from her husband's home. It came from the outside. Colleagues at Heathrow noticed her absence. Friends began asking questions. A mother doesn't just disappear without explanation, but inside the Athwal family, there was no panic, only preparation. The first story was simple. Surjit, they said, had decided to stay in India longer. She needed space. She wanted time to think. When that explanation started to fray, another replaced it. She had run away, met another man, chosen a different life. Each version painted Surjit as unstable, irresponsible, and ungrateful. Anything but a victim. Sukhdev delivered these explanations with practiced calm. To acquaintances, to officials, to anyone who asked, he spoke as if he were the one wronged. A deserted husband. A man embarrassed by a wife who had lost her way. He even filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion, formally accusing Surjit of abandoning the marriage she had been trying desperately to escape. Behind the scenes, the erasure became more deliberate. Letters were forged, made to look like official correspondence from the Metropolitan Police, sent to Indian authorities to stall inquiries and create confusion. Paperwork was altered. Property documents were falsified so Surjit's share of the family home could be transferred away from her name. Slowly, methodically, she was being removed not just from the household, but from the record. There was no missing person poster on the wall, no public appeals, no urgency. Her disappearance was treated like an inconvenience that needed administrative cleanup. The longer time passed, the easier it became to frame Surjit as someone who chose to vanish. But lies, no matter how carefully constructed, rely on one fragile thing to survive. Everyone involved has to stay silent. And inside that house, there was one person who knew the truth and was running out of ways to live with it. Surjit Kaur Athwal had lived with the truth for years before she ever spoke it out loud. As Surjit's sister-in-law, she had seen the tension inside the house long before it reached a breaking point. She heard the arguments. She noticed the fear, and she was present when conversations crossed a line from control into something far darker. What she knew wasn't speculation. It wasn't rumor. It was knowledge, the kind that changes the way you sleep at night. After Surjit vanished, Surjit watched the family move on with unsettling speed. Stories were repeated. Paperwork was handled. Life continued as if a woman had not been deliberately removed from it. Each day, Surjit carried the same question in her chest. If I speak, what happens to me? Fear kept her silent at first. Fear of retaliation. Fear of being cast out. A fear of becoming the next problem that needed to be dealt with. But silence has its own cost. Surjit began to unravel under the weight of what she knew. She thought of Surjit's children, growing up without their mother. She thought of the lies being told so easily, so confidently, and she thought of her own role in it, not as a perpetrator, but as someone who had allowed the truth to stay buried. She tried to act without being seen. Anonymous tips to Crime Stoppers, letters sent without return addresses, small attempts to break the silence without exposing herself. Each time nothing happened. Without a body, without a witness willing to attach their name to the accusation, the case went nowhere. And the longer it stalled, the more alone Surjit felt. Years passed like this. Years of rehearsing the truth in her head, of flinching at every phone call, of wondering whether justice would ever come or if Surjit's story would simply fade into rumor. By the time she realized silence was no longer an option, nearly 7 years had gone by. When Surjit finally decided to speak openly, she knew there was no undoing it. Once the words left her mouth, there would be no protection, no hiding, no pretending. But she also knew something else. If she didn't speak now, Surjit would never be heard at all. And when Surjit stepped forward with her full statement, the case that had been buried for years finally began to breathe again. When Surjit Kaur Athwal finally gave her full statement, it landed like a shockwave through a case that had long been considered dormant. For years, investigators had been stuck in the same place. A missing woman, no physical remains, one in a family that insisted there was nothing criminal to see. Surjit changed that. For the first time, there was a witness willing to describe the intent behind Surjit's disappearance, not just the aftermath. Police reopened the investigation with a different urgency. What had once been treated as a missing persons case was now pursued as a murder. Officers re-examined old files, timelines, and statements, noticing contradictions that had been dismissed before. The life insurance policy taken out on the day Surjit left the UK resurfaced as a glaring red flag. Forged letters, once brushed aside as confusion, were now understood as deliberate obstruction. British detectives traveled to India, retracing Surjit's final journey step by step. They visited the places she was believed to have passed through, speaking to locals, hotel staff, drivers, anyone who might remember a woman traveling with an older relative in December 1998. Time had eroded memories and the river had taken whatever physical evidence might once have existed. Every lead felt fragile. Every answer raised another question. In 2000, Bachchan Kaur Athwal and Sukhdev Singh Athwal were arrested for the first time. For a brief moment, it seemed like justice might finally move forward, but without enough evidence to secure charges, they were released. The disappointment was crushing. Once again, Surjit's case appeared to stall, trapped between what was known and what could be proven. Yet this time, the silence did not return. Surjit remained firm. Investigators persisted. Piece by piece, they built a case not around a body, but around intent, planning, and deception. It was risky. Convictions without remains were rare, but the story the evidence told was becoming impossible to ignore. Nearly 9 years after Surjit vanished, the question was no longer whether she was alive. The question was whether a jury would believe that a woman could be murdered so completely that nothing of her was left behind. The trial opened at the Old Bailey in 2007, almost 9 years after Surjit Athwal had vanished. There was still no body, no forensic photographs, no physical proof of death laid out for the jury to see. What the prosecution had instead was a story, one stitched together from intent, timing, lies, and fear. And they were asking 12 strangers to decide whether that story was enough. In the courtroom, Bakan Kaur Athwal sat composed, her face unreadable. Sukhdev sat beside her, distant, guarded. They were not being tried for a moment of rage or an accident gone wrong. They were being tried for planning, for conspiracy, for making a woman disappear and then pretending she chose to leave. The prosecution laid it out carefully, knowing that without a body, every detail mattered. They spoke of Surjit's desire for divorce and the family's obsession with honor. They traced the timeline of the India trip, highlighting how carefully it had been arranged. They pointed to the life insurance policy taken out on the very day Surjit left the country, a financial decision that made no sense unless her death was anticipated. They exposed the forged letters, the altered property documents, the divorce petition filed as if Surjit were the one who had abandoned her family. And then Surjit Kaur Athwal took the stand. Her testimony was steady but heavy, each sentence carrying years of fear and guilt. She described the family meeting, the words used, the decision to get rid of Surjit. She spoke about what it meant to live in that house, about how loyalty was demanded and silence was enforced. The defense tried to paint her as unreliable, as someone seeking attention, as a woman confused by grief. But her story did not change. The defense argued absence, no body, no eyewitness to the killing, no certainty. They suggested Surjit had run away, that she had chosen a different life. But the jury had already seen the pattern, the planning, the deception, the motive. They understood that Surjit's absence wasn't evidence of innocence. It was evidence of how thorough the crime had been. When the verdict was read, the courtroom went still. Guilty. Bachan Kaur Athwal and Sukhdev Singh Athwal were both convicted of murder and conspiracy to murder. A conviction secured not through remains, but through truth finally spoken out loud. Yet as the court adjourned, one truth remained unavoidable. Surjit Athwal was still gone, and no verdict could bring her back. The sentences were handed down with the gravity the case demanded, but without any sense of closure. Bachan Kaur Athwal was given life imprisonment, the court acknowledging her central role in orchestrating the murder. Sukhdev Singh Athwal received a life sentence as well, his punishment reflecting not just what he did, but what he failed to do: protect his wife when it mattered most. Later appeals would reduce their minimum terms, but the verdict itself stood. The law had finally spoken. For Surjit's children, a justice arrived too late to change the shape of their lives. They had grown up without their mother, without answers, without the comfort of knowing where she rested. After the convictions, they were taken into care, their futures shaped by a crime committed long before they were old enough to understand it. Money wrongfully gained through fraud and manipulation was confiscated and redirected for their benefit, a symbolic attempt to return something that could never truly be replaced. Outside the courtroom, the case sent shockwaves through communities that had long avoided confronting crimes committed in the name of honor. It forced uncomfortable conversations about control disguised as tradition, about how silence protects abusers, and about how easily a woman's suffering can be minimized when reputation is at stake. For many, the convictions were not just about Surjit Athwal, they were about acknowledging a pattern that had been ignored for too long. Still, the absence remained. There was no grave to visit, no physical place to mourn. Surjit's life was accounted for in court documents and sentencing remarks, but her body was never recovered. Justice, while real, felt incomplete, a verdict without a farewell. And yet, even in that absence, Surjit's story refused to end quietly, because what happened to her would go on to change how honor-based violence was recognized, investigated, and spoken about, ensuring that her silence would not be repeated in others. Surjit Athwal's body was never found. The river that carried her away kept it secret, denying her children a grave, denying the world a final image to hold on to. But what could not be buried was the truth of what had been done to her. Her disappearance, once dismissed as choice or coincidence, became a landmark case that forced a legal and cultural reckoning. In the years that followed the convictions, Surjit's name began to mean more than loss. It became a warning, a reminder of what happens when control is mistaken for tradition, when honor is valued above human life, and when silence is demanded instead of justice. Her murder exposed how easily abuse can hide behind family loyalty and how dangerous it becomes when fear keeps witnesses quiet. Surjit Kaur Athwal carried that lesson forward. After years of living with guilt and terror, she transformed her pain into action, speaking publicly about honor-based violence and founding the organization True Honor to help others trapped in similar situations. Where Surjit had been silenced, Surjit chose to speak, ensuring that other women might find the courage and support Surjit never had. There is no ending that makes this story comfortable, no resolution that restores what was taken. A woman sought independence, asked for a divorce, and paid with her life. The people responsible were punished, but punishment could not undo the years of fear, the loss suffered by her children, or the emptiness left behind. Surjit Athwal never came home, but her story did, and it stands as a stark reminder that when violence hides behind tradition, when families choose reputation over life, and when silence is treated as obedience, tragedy is not an accident, it is a decision. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if you believe more people need to understand the realities of honor-based violence, make sure to like this video, share it, and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover hidden truths and give a voice to those who never had the chance to speak for themselves.